Alright, we're just picking up where we left off, and we're just going to prep this frame to install the new engine. So what I'm doing right now is just moving the wiring out of the way and removing extra things that would be in the way so that I can blast and coat this frame. And some of these things are going to be replaced because I have better parts in the basement, like these switch housings and etc. So I'm just taking some of this wiring and zip tying it up out of the way. And I'm only unplugging this so that I can swing this big wad of wiring down out of the way of the frame. And here's the hoses that were trapped behind the coolant reservoir. Then I'm taking these plastic covers off. Of course, they'll have to be painted. And I'm just putting the bolts back in to keep the blast media and the powder coating out of the threads. These fuel tank pads come off, and these plastic covers over the welds. Then I'm just going to wheel it out onto the patio, and when it comes back, the visible parts of the frame will be gold. And I'll tell you right now, my powder coating of the frame was an epic failure, and I'll document the whole thing in another video. And I ended up just painting the frame with some gold single stage paint. And I ended up using the powder coating for smaller metal parts that would fit in the oven, like the valve covers. So I just begin routing the throttle cables, and then I'm bolting the cruise cancel switch back onto the frame, and it shares a bracket with some of the hydraulic components for the braking system, proportioning valve or whatever this is. I'm reattaching the wiring harness to the frame, and I'm cleaning these terminals with some contact cleaner and a brass brush. Every electrical connector on this bike was heavily corroded. Somebody in one of my Goldwing Facebook groups was raving about a product they use for this, but I can't find the post. So if any of you guys have an idea of a product that's best for cleaning these electrical connections, mention it in the comments. Now I'm just going to wheel the engine back under the frame. And I decided to take the coolant reservoir down out of the way for the time being. Then I'm going to feed that section of the wiring harness back underneath the cooling hoses. The last thing I took loose before we wheeled the engine out from underneath the bike in the last video. Then I'm lowering the frame onto the engine, and of course you have to stab the drive shaft onto the spline and then put the boot on. And then you have to do some work positioning the engine and the frame to line the mounting holes up so you can get the bolts through. And it's a struggle, it takes a while. Until you can finally stab an upper mounting bolt through. And then I tighten these jack bolts on the left hand side of the engine because it helps me line up the bolt holes on the right hand side. And I lost the footage of installing the 2 bolts on the right hand side and then putting the nuts on and torquing these down, but you get the picture. What I'm doing here is installing the all balls tapered steering neck bearings, and I will post that process in a separate video that you guys can watch. I'm just going to show it briefly here. Then I'm going to go ahead and just slide the new front end up into place. And this front end's already assembled. The front end I took off, I disassembled as I took it off. But this one's already assembled. And I'll just hold it up with this jack so it doesn't slip out. And I just use a punch to tighten these nuts. I don't have a special wrench for this. And I treat these just like they're a wheel bearing. I like to tighten them until they're just slightly over tight. And that helps me make sure that the cups are fully seated and everything. And then I'll back it off a little. So you can see me just checking to see if it's binding yet. And then once I've got it just ever so slightly over tight, then I'll back it off a bit until it's completely free and there's no end play. Then I put the jam nut on and bend the little fingers up on the metal retainer, and then I can install the new top clamp with the new handlebars. Then I get out my Ford tool and I just tighten it till my elbow clicks. Then I tighten these pinch bolts. This is the powder coated wheel from my other project. And the wheel I took off actually had 3 dings in it. 2 dings in the lip in one side and 1 ding in the other. When I did the walk around video, I only saw the 1 ding. That wheel was trash. Thank goodness I had this good wheel already powder coated with a new tire on it. So I just line it up and put the axle through, put the nut on. The torque spec for the axle is 59 Newton meters. Let me know in the comments how many ooga-doogas you think 59 Newton meters is. Axle holders, 22 Newton meters. Then I can bolt the brake caliper back on. Since I have my top engine mount bolts in place, I can lift this frame up and slide my transmission jack out of the way in preparation for the engine subframes to be bolted on. But before we do that, earlier I had removed the alternator from the old engine and I sent it out to a local alternator repair shop to be disassembled and cleaned and gone through. When I got it back, I decided it needed a new O-ring. So I have these 2 O-ring assortments, one's standard and one's metric, and I use these brass O-ring picks because I can remove the O-ring without marring the aluminum. And you would assume that the O-ring is metric, and I'm sure it is, but these O-rings are generic and they come in different thicknesses, and I always just test O-rings out of both kits until I find one that's the best fit. Sometimes you get surprised. Now, it would have been way easier to install this alternator with the engine out of the bike, but it was still away at the alternator shop and I wanted to continue the project. And of course, I've replaced these alternators before in the bike. Now, I always remove the fuel tank. You saw in the previous video how easy it is to pull the fuel tank out, and that gives you a lot more access. Now, I've removed these alternators without pulling the fuel tank before. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and I used extensions and swivels and all kinds of things. And you certainly can change the alternator without pulling the fuel tank out, but I wouldn't. It's just way easier to just get the fuel tank out of the way, and you have access to all the bolts and you can get your hands in there. Sometimes we just do a lot of extra work trying to avoid work. I tighten up these bolts in stages. It pulls the O-ring in more evenly. And I just work my way around, tightening each bolt a little bit at a time, because I don't want to pinch or twist that O-ring or anything and cause a leak right away in a brand new O-ring. Put a little bit of grease on the O-ring too. It's a little bit of a struggle to hook the cable on and hook up the pigtail from the wiring harness. And I can go ahead and put the dipstick back in the coolant overflow. And putting the cable on the alternator reminded me of the cable on the starter, so my ADD forced me to go put the cable on the starter. And then there's a set of grounds that all come together on this bolt right here, and it was all green and corroded, so I decided to take it loose and clean it up with some emery cloth and then tighten it back down. A lot of the wiring harness butchery that I found were like supplemental grounds, which leads me to believe the owner had a ground issue that he couldn't find, and so I'm just addressing each one of these as I find them. Then I'm just running the engine subframes across the wire wheel because they were pretty nasty. So you can see I've got the right hand subframe right here, and I'm just going to wiggle it into place. Massage it in there with this soft face hammer. I certainly don't have to hit it too hard, just tap it a little so I could get the bolt holes to line up. Same thing with the left side subframe. The left-hand subframe has the shift linkage and the side stand attached to it. So I have to hook up the pigtail for the side stand switch into the wiring harness. And we're on the left side of the frame, which has the jack bolts that pinch the engine, so you got to tighten that down. And then tighten the jam nut or the castle nut before you can put the motor mount bolt in place. And then I just go ahead and hook up the shift linkage to the engine. Then while I'm down here, I go ahead and put the new oil filter on because I don't want to forget. And I just put a little bit of new motor oil on the O-ring. And then for whatever reason, I decide that now is the perfect time to replace this rear brake caliper. I just had a better one on hand, and this is when I noticed that you have to take the rear wheel loose to get the brake caliper on and off. So I take it loose. Bolt the new caliper on. Up the hoses. And I keep saying new. I hope you guys realize these are all just good used parts that I had on hand. Then I put the rear wheel back on. Then I decide it's time to start sorting out the front brake system. So I left the old front brakes attached when I disassembled the motorcycle, but the front end that I had on hand and just installed on the bike has front brake components on it that are in way better shape. And so there's a lot of overlap, and I just have to decide how much I'm going to keep and what to remove, and then hook the two together, and that's what I'm doing here. Then the old junk goes in the trash. Now I'm going to hook up the cruise control and the throttle cables, and I'll spare you watching that struggle. And since I just hooked up the other end of these throttle cables, I decide now's the time to install this switch housing because the throttle cables are attached to it. Throttle tube switch housing. And then while I'm here, I go ahead and install the replacement master cylinder. You probably saw in my walk around video that one of the front brake calipers locked up, and that either meant that the caliper itself was seized or that the master cylinder needed rebuilt. and I just happen to have components that were in better shape. You know, I've parted out a lot of these Goldwings and I have a lot of parts laying around. That's really the only thing that made this project worth doing, was the fact that I had most of the parts I needed on hand already and I barely had to buy anything. Then you'll see I can take the hose off the old master cylinder and hook it to the new one. Here I am installing the left switch housing. Then I'm opening up the handlebar so that I can route the clutch hose and the wires through the handlebar. And I hook up the clutch switch. Put the cover back on. Then I do the same thing on the right hand side. Take the cover off. Stuff the brake hose and the wiring inside the handlebar. The throttle cables are routed outside of the handlebar. Then I can put the cover back on. And I'm just routing wires and cables. There's an engine ground cable and a reverse switch, ring terminals. And I'm hooking up the spark plug wires. This is a sub harness for the fuel injectors. Go ahead and plug in the fuel injectors. Then I install this fuel injector rail cover, and it has the radiator stay on it. And once that's in place, I can go ahead and mount the radiator. Now the radiator I decided to use is on the right hand side there, and it is an aftermarket aluminum radiator that I assume was made in China. Now they actually did a beautiful job in making it. You know, the welds are beautiful. It's got aluminum tanks on the ends, a larger surface area than the original, which makes me believe it'll cool even better. And it was cheap. I already had it in the basement from another project, but they didn't do such a great job of making it a bolt-in replacement. The bolt holes don't line up, and the tabs are too wide to mount the black plastic mesh. So it takes some doing to mount it to the bike, but it does fit inside the fairing and it doesn't leak and it does work, so that's what we're going to use. Now look how bad the original radiator is here on the left. Look at all the sediment. It's basically a coarse sand. And when I pull it out of the way, look at the sand that's left on the table. And I didn't beat this out or anything. This is just from setting the radiator on the table and then picking it back up. And this is coarse sand like you'd find at a lake here in Indiana. I don't know if this motorcycle was in a flood or what. And here's a photo of some of the same sediment all over the top of the engine that I just pulled out of this bike. Here you can see the end of the fuel rail and one of the injectors in the photo. And now I'd really like to know what this motorcycle has been through. So if you have any ideas, please comment. Or if you used to own this motorcycle, please comment. I would love to hear from you. I don't have any hard feelings. I bought this motorcycle for a project and I believe this is good content. So I'm not upset, and if you used to own this motorcycle, I'd like to hear from you. So I'm just bolting this radiator to the frame. Hooking up the hoses. Tightening the clamps. So I end up taking some side cuts and just cutting the slots open on this plastic mesh so they'll fit over the tabs on the aftermarket radiator. Then I get up in here and just plug in everything we unplugged in the first video. Assembly is literally the reverse of disassembly. Then I decide to go ahead and stick the fuel tank in, and you'll see I forgot to put the rubber cushions back on the frame, so later this fuel tank will have to come back out so that I can install those. So I'm hooking up the fuel lines. Plugging in the pigtails for the pump to sending unit. And then I bolt it down, and then in a few minutes I'll realize that it's a whole lot easier to put the airbox in if you haven't bolted the fuel tank down yet. I go ahead and plug in the camshaft position sensor, the fuel injectors, and the engine coolant temperature sensor. Struggle, struggle, struggle. Install the fuel rail cover, which is also the radiator stay. And I scuffed those up with 400 grit, that maroon Scotch Brite, and then shot them with some Stingle Stage satin black. When I start hooking up the radiator hose in the back, that's the hardest one, especially since I trim these a little bit. When I reuse hoses, I like to trim just a little bit off the ends. That makes them a little bit shorter, but they seal better. Tighten up the hose clamps. Then I go ahead and hook up these spark plug wires. I'm all over the place. There's a whole bunch of wiring in this boot. These are the wires for the rear brake pedal, the one that cancels the cruise control and the one for the brake light. And after I get this hooked up, I decide it might be time to fill this engine up with oil. But before I do that, I was wanting to powder coat these valve covers. And I'm gonna post a full video of that process for you guys to watch. This is just a preview of it. But I wanted to go ahead and do it now because I'm thinking about filling this engine up with oil, and I don't want to have to drain the oil again and then powder coat the valve covers and then put the oil back in. And the very last thing you want to do is fire up this engine without any oil in it. And I'm using that Rotella T6 right here. And you can see the valve covers already powder coated in the video. And I start putting the foot peg on, and then I realize that it's a lot easier to get to the pinch bolt on the rear brake lever if you haven't already put the foot peg on. I powder coated these little bolts too, and I'll post that in a separate video so you can see how I went about it. And I just continue to reassemble the wiring harness, plugging in endless connectors everywhere. Then I decided to install this ignition switch, and when I removed the old one I found more wiring harness butchery. And I had this other ignition switch with a Terminator skull on the key that I made for another project. I know it's a little bit hypocritical because I'm kind of a less is more guy, but I think it's pretty cool. This is one I made from a resin skull on my Yamaha Raider. Say something in the comments if you'd like to see a video on how I made these keys. Anyway, back to business. I'm just installing this unmolested ignition switch. Plugging in the other end of the pigtail. Then I go to installing the headers. First the right hand side. Then the left. And that hose you see hanging down is just a new coolant hose I put on, and eventually I'll cut it to length and plumb it into that T where we drained the coolant in the first video, behind the evap canister. I cut the original hoses a little too short when I removed this engine. But before we put that canister back on, it's a great time to bleed that clutch, because it's a lot easier to get to the bleeder on the clutch slave cylinder if that evap canister isn't in the way. And I'll try and post a comprehensive video on bleeding the clutch later, but this is just some brief footage bleeding the clutch. This is just me buttoning up that evap canister and those coolant hoses to that drain, trimming the hoses to length, bolting it in place. So I decide to fire the engine very briefly before I install the airbox, just to see if there's any issues. And of course it wouldn't start, and I had to diagnose all kinds of electrical problems. Remember those wires jumpered together off the old ignition switch? Well, that seems to tie into some more butchery here underneath the relay box. So with a properly wired ignition switch, now this wouldn't work. And I noticed one of the reversing relays was really hot, and so it had been hot wired on, which led me to the reverse diode assembly, which according to the wiring diagrams provides the negative half of the signal to the starter contactor. And this one is obviously bad, so that's why they had to jumper that reverse relay on to start the motorcycle. So I just bought a used one on eBay. I also found the kill switch on the handlebar was bypassed. Of course, when I tested the kill switch, there wasn't anything wrong with it at all. So I basically corrected all of this wiring and made it match the diagrams again. My troubleshooting eventually led me to the fuse box, where I found more butchery and more corrosion, which I addressed, and I decided to get some new screws out of a fuse box I had in the basement. And that's when I noticed that someone had installed a bunch of 20 amp fuses, where there should have only been 5 or 15 amp fuses. And that is a fantastic way to melt your wiring or even start a fire right next to your fuel tank. And now I can hear what you're all saying to yourselves. With that many problems, I would have just replaced the whole wiring harness. No, you wouldn't. This is the wiring harness off of a 2003 GL1800 on the floor of my shop. It weighs 25 pounds, and this is a partially disassembled wiring harness dangling off the motorcycle we're currently working on. Now, if you think you can replace all of this and get it perfectly correct, and that will save you from having to do any electrical troubleshooting, I got bad news for you. Now, that being said, if you've actually done it, please post a link in the comments to your video of your complete GL1800 wiring harness swap. I would love to see that, and I would commend you, and I would subscribe to your channel because you're a way better man than I am. Now, that being said, I consistently see a lot of basic troubleshooting questions in the GL1800 forums and Facebook groups. And I'd like to make some videos on basic electrical troubleshooting that would work on any vehicle, but I'm going to demonstrate them on the Goldwing. And that should help you guys diagnose components without just loading up the parts cannon and replacing them. Wouldn't you like to know that kill switch was bad before you bought one or bypassed it? Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more videos like that, because I can make them. Now that that's squared away, I can go ahead and install the airbox. Remember when I said I bolted down the fuel tank a little too early? Yeah, now we're backtracking. Having the fuel tank loose makes it a whole lot easier to get to the hoses underneath. And finally, I get it screwed down, and then we can install the air cleaner. And about now is when I find out that all the screw threads are stripped out of the air cleaner housing, and I have to go to the basement and get a replacement and replace the whole airbox again. But I'll spare you having to watch that. Then I can go ahead and install this housing that contains the cruise control module, the ECM, the cruise control actuator, bolt it down, plug in the ECM, the cruise reverse module, the barometric pressure switch, the air intake temperature sensor. And these are all the wiring connectors for the radio and stuff in the shelter. Now I've pushed the motorcycle outside to fill it up with coolant in case I make a mess. And I'll do a complete video on draining and filling the coolant separate from this. I use the blue coolant for Asian vehicles, and I've already diluted this 50-50 with distilled water. And the reason we fired the engine off earlier is because you want to be able to run your water pump during the coolant fill. Once I get it capped off, I start thinking about taking this thing for a spin, but first I better make sure we have some brakes. So I push the bike back inside and we're bleeding the brakes, and I'll do a comprehensive video on a complete brake bleed separate from this video. This is just some brief footage of me bleeding the brakes. But this project was already huge, and this video is already long and complicated without breaking each of these procedures down into their individual parts. So I think those will make great separate videos. Then I decide to fire this thing up and take it for a little test drive before we put all the Tupperware back on, just in case there's something we need to get back in here and address. Now, I filmed this in portrait so I could use this footage for a short, so I apologize for that aspect ratio being incorrect, but I'll upload the short right after I upload this video so that you guys can watch it all in portrait. And I think that's a fantastic place to end this, so the next video will be final assembly. Thank you for watching.